I'm Daniel Reed, 64 years old, and this is the story of how my son-in-law learned that calling a former NSA cyber operations officer too old for technology is the kind of mistake that ends with federal agents kicking down your door at dawn. Especially when that officer spent 26 years developing offensive cyber capabilities, breaking encryption systems, and hunting adversaries in digital spaces where most people don't even know battles are being fought. For weeks after we buried my daughter Emily, my son-in-law Kyle Bradford walked into my house carrying his laptop and wearing the kind of smug expression that comes from thinking you're the smartest person in any room. He was 32 years old, CEO of a cryptocurrency company called Blockchain Ventures, drove a Tesla, and had the confidence of someone who'd made millions in an industry he barely understood. He sat down at my kitchen table without being invited and started talking to me like I was a confused elderly relative who needed basic concepts explained in simple terms. Before I tell you how Kyle learned that cybersecurity expertise doesn't expire with age and that underestimating someone who worked at the NSA is catastrophically stupid, I need you to do something. If you've ever been dismissed as too old for technology, if someone has assumed you don't understand computers because of your age, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next will show you why experience in cyber operations is more valuable than any computer science degree. And leave a comment telling me about a time someone underestimated your technical knowledge. I read every comment and your stories matter. Kyle opened his laptop and pulled up what he called a presentation about my financial future. He explained that he'd been thinking about my situation and was concerned about my retirement security. I was 64 years old, he said, living on a government pension that probably didn't keep up with inflation. My house was paid off but aging and would need expensive repairs. I didn't seem to understand modern financial instruments or investment opportunities. Kyle said this with the absolute certainty of someone who thought anyone over 50 was functionally illiterate when it came to technology and finance. He showed me charts and graphs about cryptocurrency markets, blockchain technology, and decentralized finance. He used terms like smart contracts and non-fungible tokens and decentralized autonomous organizations, speaking slowly and clearly like he was teaching a child. He explained that the future of money was digital and that people my age who didn't understand this were going to be left behind economically. Traditional investments like bonds and index funds were obsolete, he said. The real wealth was being created in crypto, and people who didn't adapt would watch their savings become worthless. Kyle said he wanted to help me because Emily would have wanted him to take care of her father. He was offering to manage my retirement savings and invest them in cryptocurrency opportunities through his company. He'd be taking a small management fee, of course, but the returns would be so substantial that I'd barely notice the fees. He showed me projections suggesting I could triple my retirement savings in 2 years if I let him invest it properly. I sat there drinking my coffee and said nothing, which Kyle interpreted as confusion rather than the calculated silence I'd learned during 26 years of intelligence work. He kept talking, getting more enthusiastic as he described the massive returns his other clients were seeing. He mentioned that he'd recently helped several elderly investors, people in their 60s and 70s who didn't understand technology, and they were thrilled with how much money they were making. He said I should trust him because he was family and because he understood this new digital world in ways my generation simply couldn't. Then Kyle said something that revealed just how completely he'd misunderstood my background and capabilities. He said he knew I'd worked for the government doing something with computers, probably data entry or basic IT support. That must have been fine in the 1990s when computers were simpler, he said, but modern technology was exponentially more complex. Blockchain and cryptocurrency required understanding advanced cryptography, distributed systems, and game theory that would be beyond someone from my generation. He wasn't insulting me, he emphasized. He was just being realistic about the generational digital divide. I asked Kyle what he knew about my actual career. He shrugged and said Emily had mentioned I'd worked at Fort Meade doing something with the NSA, probably maintaining their computer systems or managing databases. Government IT work, he said dismissively. Not real technology innovation like what happened in Silicon Valley. I asked if he knew what the NSA actually did. Kyle said something vague about signals intelligence and surveillance, clearly not really understanding what those terms meant. Here's what Kyle didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask about or investigate because he'd been so certain that anyone my age was technologically obsolete. Kyle didn't know that I hadn't been an IT support worker or a database administrator at the NSA. I'd been a cyber operations officer in the Information Assurance Directorate and later in Tailored Access Operations, units whose existence wasn't publicly acknowledged during most of my career. I'd spent 26 years developing and executing offensive cyber operations against adversary networks, breaking encryption systems that protected classified communications, and building tools that could penetrate supposedly secure systems. Kyle didn't know that my education included a bachelor's degree in mathematics from MIT, a master's degree in computer science from Stanford, and a PhD in cryptography from Carnegie Mellon, all funded by the NSA because they'd recruited me straight out of my undergraduate program when they'd seen my test scores and my natural aptitude for breaking codes. I'd studied under some of the world's leading cryptographers and computer scientists. I'd published papers in classified journals about vulnerabilities in encryption systems and techniques for network penetration. Kyle didn't know that I'd been part of the team that developed some of the tools and techniques the NSA still uses today for cyber operations. I'd worked on projects with code names that were classified at levels above top secret. I'd briefed the director of the NSA and members of congressional intelligence committees about cyber capabilities and vulnerabilities. I'd been read into programs that Kyle would never know existed because they dealt with capabilities that would fundamentally change how he thought about computer security if he understood them. Kyle didn't know that I still held an active top secret/SCI clearance because I did consulting work for defense contractors and government agencies that needed expertise in cybersecurity and cryptanalysis. I hadn't retired and gone fishing. I transitioned to consulting work where I made more money in a few months than Kyle probably thought I made in a year from my pension. I advised Fortune 500 companies on securing their networks. I did penetration testing for major financial institutions. I analyzed encryption implementations for companies developing secure communication systems. Most importantly, Kyle didn't know that his presentation about cryptocurrency and blockchain technology had immediately triggered multiple red flags for someone with my background. The returns he was promising were impossible without either taking massive risks or running a Ponzi scheme. The terminology he was using was technically correct, but was being applied in ways that suggested he either didn't understand the underlying technology or was deliberately misrepresenting how it worked. The investment structure he was describing had all the characteristics of fraud schemes I'd seen analyzed in classified briefings about cybercriminals and financial crime. When Kyle finished his presentation, he pulled out documents he wanted me to sign: investment agreements, power of attorney forms, account transfer authorizations. He said I should trust him to handle everything because this technology was too complex for someone my age to understand. All I needed to do was sign the papers and transfer my retirement savings to accounts his company managed. He'd handle all the complicated blockchain and cryptocurrency stuff, and I'd just watch my money grow. I looked at those documents for a long moment. Then I told Kyle no. I wasn't signing anything. I wasn't transferring my savings to him. And I had serious concerns about whether his business was legitimate or was actually a fraud scheme targeting vulnerable investors who didn't understand cryptocurrency technology. Kyle's expression shifted from condescending patience to irritation. He said I was being stubborn and paranoid, that I was letting fear of new technology prevent me from securing my financial future. He said this was exactly the problem with older people. They were so stuck in the past that they couldn't recognize opportunities. If I wasn't going to let him help me, fine, but I'd regret it when inflation ate away my savings while people who'd invested in crypto became wealthy. Then Kyle said something that made my jaw clench even though I kept my expression neutral. He said Emily would be disappointed in me for being so closed-minded and fearful. She'd understood that Kyle was successful and innovative, that he represented the future while I represented the past. She'd trusted his judgment on financial matters because she'd known her father was just an old government worker who didn't understand modern business. That was a lie. I knew it was a lie because Emily had come to me 3 months before she died in that accident. A random tragedy. A truck driver who fell asleep and crossed the median and told me she was worried about Kyle's business. She'd discovered irregularities in the company's financial records. Money coming in from investors, but not being invested the way Kyle claimed. Returns being paid from new investor money rather than from actual profits. She'd been planning to confront Kyle and possibly report the company to financial regulators. But then the accident happened, and she was gone. After Kyle left, I sat at my kitchen table thinking about Emily and about what she'd discovered. Thinking about Kyle's pitch that had all the hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme. Thinking about how he dismissed my entire career as basic IT work done by someone too old to understand modern technology. Thinking about the elderly investors he'd mentioned who thought they were making money but were probably being defrauded. I went to my study, which Kyle would probably have dismissed as an old man's cluttered office with outdated equipment. What it actually was a fully operational cybersecurity research station. 3 high-end workstations running multiple operating systems. A network security testing lab with isolated virtual environments. Software-defined radios for signals analysis. Hardware for cryptographic testing. A secure connection to contract work I did for defense and intelligence agencies. And most importantly, tools and techniques I developed or had access to from 26 years at the NSA. I pulled out the files Emily had hidden in my house before she died. Files she'd labeled as recipe collections, but that actually contained financial records from blockchain ventures showing evidence of fraud. Then I sat down at my primary workstation and started doing what I'd spent 26 years learning to do at the NSA. I started investigating a target, looking for vulnerabilities, gathering intelligence, and building a comprehensive picture of what was really happening. Kyle thought I was too old for technology. He thought his cryptocurrency business and his blockchain knowledge made him superior to some old government worker who'd probably used punch cards. He'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating someone who'd spent over 2 decades developing offensive cyber capabilities for the NSA. He was about to learn that cyber operations expertise doesn't expire. That understanding cryptography and network security and digital forensics at the level I'd worked at gives you capabilities that most civilians can't even imagine. That dismissing someone as too old for technology, when that someone has forgotten more about computer systems than you'll ever know, is the kind of mistake that has consequences measured in federal prison time. I made my first call to Colonel Rhett James Patterson, who'd worked with me at NSA before retiring and joining the FBI Cyber Division as a senior technical advisor. I told him I needed to discuss a potential cybercrime operation targeting elderly investors through cryptocurrency fraud. James said he'd be very interested in that conversation and asked if this was related to blockchain ventures. Apparently, Kyle's company had already attracted the attention of people in the financial crime community. My second call was to Sarah Martinez, who'd been one of my best analysts at NSA before leaving to work for the Securities and Exchange Commission's Office of Cybersecurity. I told her I had evidence of what appeared to be a Ponzi scheme operating through cryptocurrency investments. Sarah said the SEC was actively investigating several cryptocurrency fraud operations and would be very interested in any solid evidence. My third call was to Michael Chun, a former NSA colleague who'd retired and now did cryptocurrency forensic analysis for a firm that specialized in tracking blockchain transactions for law enforcement. I asked if he'd be willing to analyze the financial flows of a company I suspected was committing fraud. Michael said absolutely, and mentioned that analyzing cryptocurrency scams had become a major part of his business because so many people were running schemes in the crypto space. Over the next week, I did what I'd spent 26 years doing. I gathered intelligence systematically and methodically. I started with open source research using techniques that were perfectly legal, but that most people didn't know how to do effectively. I analyzed blockchain ventures' public claims about their technology and their investment returns. I examined Kyle's social media presence and his public statements about cryptocurrency. I searched for information about the company's business relationships, their technology stack, their claimed innovations. What I found was concerning and familiar. Blockchain ventures claimed to be using artificial intelligence and advanced algorithms to trade cryptocurrency for massive profits. But the technical descriptions of their systems were nonsensical word salad. They were using blockchain terminology in ways that didn't make technical sense. They were promising returns of 20 to 30% annually, which was impossible to achieve consistently through legitimate trading. And they were heavily marketing to elderly investors, people who Kyle had specifically mentioned didn't understand technology. I pulled the financial records Emily had saved. They showed that blockchain ventures was taking in money from new investors and using it to pay returns to existing investors. Very little money was actually being invested in cryptocurrency or anything else. The company was keeping a substantial percentage of investor money as fees and expenses. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme disguised with cryptocurrency and blockchain terminology, that made it sound sophisticated and legitimate. Then I started using capabilities that went beyond open-source research. I'm not going to detail exactly what tools and techniques I used, because some of them came from my NSA background and are still sensitive. But I will say that when you've spent 26 years learning how to penetrate secure networks and analyze protected data, you develop capabilities that don't go away just because you've retired. And I will say that everything I did was either legally authorized under my continuing clearance and consulting work, or was done in ways that would be admissible as evidence if investigations led to prosecution. What I found was worse than I'd suspected. Blockchain Ventures wasn't just running a Ponzi scheme with cryptocurrency. Kyle was also involved in actual cybercrime, hacking into people's cryptocurrency wallets and stealing their holdings, using his company's legitimate-looking infrastructure to run phishing operations that trick people into revealing their private keys, operating dark web services that facilitated money laundering. The cryptocurrency business was camouflage for a broader criminal operation. I documented everything meticulously: the Ponzi scheme structure, the stolen cryptocurrency, the phishing operations, the money laundering, the fake technical claims, the targeting of vulnerable elderly investors. I built a comprehensive intelligence package that would give law enforcement everything they needed to build a federal case. Kyle had called me too old for technology and had dismissed my government IT work as irrelevant to his sophisticated blockchain business. He'd thought his cryptocurrency knowledge and his youth gave him an insurmountable advantage over some old man who'd worked with computers back in the 1990s. What Kyle didn't understand was that the NSA doesn't hire people to do basic IT support. They hire mathematicians and computer scientists and cryptographers to break codes that nations think are secure. They train people in techniques that make commercial hacking look like children playing with toys. And those skills, that training, that experience, it doesn't expire just because you retire. Kyle was about to learn that underestimating an NSA cyber operations officer, regardless of age, was the worst mistake of his criminal career. The investigation was beginning. And once the NSA trains you to hunt in digital spaces, you never forget how to find your target. The morning after my initial investigation of Kyle's operation, I woke at 0500 with the same internal clock that had governed my schedule for 26 years at the NSA. I made coffee, did my morning workout. Physical fitness doesn't become optional just because you're in your 60s, and sat down at my primary workstation to begin a systematic intelligence collection operation against Blockchain Ventures. The first principle of intelligence work is understanding your target completely before you act. You don't reveal what you know until you've gathered everything you need and positioned all your assets for maximum effect. Kyle thought I was just some confused old man who'd rejected his investment pitch. He had no idea I was conducting the kind of comprehensive investigation that the NSA used to prepare for cyber operations against adversary networks. I started by mapping Blockchain Ventures' digital infrastructure. Every company has a digital footprint: websites, servers, network architecture, security configurations. Finding and analyzing that footprint is fundamental cybersecurity work, and I'd spent 2 decades teaching people at the NSA how to do it against the most sophisticated adversaries in the world. Kyle's company wasn't sophisticated. They bought standard web hosting, used commercial email services, and had security configurations that would make any competent security professional cringe. Using tools that were completely legal, network scanning utilities, DNS analysis tools, certificate transparency logs, I mapped out Blockchain Ventures infrastructure. They had one web server, one email server, and several virtual private servers hosted at a commercial data center. Their security certificates revealed when services were set up, who managed them, and what technologies they used. Their domain registration showed Kyle owned dozens of related domains, many with names suggesting they were being used for phishing operations. I examined the company's website in detail. The technical claims about their blockchain technology and AI trading algorithms were nonsensical to anyone who actually understood the technology. They were using blockchain buzzwords randomly, claiming capabilities that were technically impossible, describing processes that didn't make sense. It was clear Kyle either didn't understand the technology he was claiming to use, or he understood it well enough to know his investors wouldn't. The website had testimonials from satisfied investors showing massive returns. I analyzed the photographs and text using tools I developed for analyzing disinformation campaigns. The photos were stock images purchased from commercial sites. The testimonials were fake, written in a style that suggested they'd been generated by the same person trying to mimic different voices. Everything about the website was designed to look professional and legitimate to someone who didn't know how to look deeper. James Patterson from the FBI Cyber Division called with interesting information. The Bureau had received multiple complaints about blockchain ventures over the past 18 months. Elderly investors who'd put money into the company and then couldn't get it back when they tried to withdraw. One complaint from a family whose elderly father had lost his entire retirement savings to what they suspected was a scam. Another from someone who discovered that the blockchain addresses Kyle claimed were holding their invested funds actually belonged to completely different entities. James said the FBI had opened a preliminary investigation but hadn't had enough evidence yet to move forward with anything formal. The cryptocurrency space was difficult to investigate because the technology was complex and because many victims didn't realize they'd been defrauded until it was too late. James asked if I had solid evidence. I told him I was working on building a comprehensive package that would give them everything they needed, and I'd have it ready within 2 weeks. Sarah Martinez from the SEC called with her findings. She'd pulled Blockchain Ventures' corporate filings and registration documents. The company was registered as an investment advisor, but had never properly registered with the SEC as required for companies managing investor funds. Kyle had filed paperwork claiming the company was exempt from registration because they only handled accredited investors. But Sarah's investigation showed they were actively soliciting non-accredited investors, particularly elderly people with modest savings. That was a clear securities law violation. Sarah had also discovered that Kyle had been involved with 2 previous companies that had gone bankrupt under suspicious circumstances. Both had been in the financial technology space. Both had raised money from investors and then collapsed, leaving investors with substantial losses, while Kyle had somehow walked away without personal liability. There was a pattern of Kyle creating companies, attracting investors with promises of high returns, and then leaving wreckage behind when the schemes collapsed. Michael Chen called with his cryptocurrency forensic analysis. He'd tracked the blockchain addresses that Blockchain Ventures claimed were holding investor funds. The analysis was damning. The addresses showed a classic Ponzi scheme pattern. Money coming in from many sources, money going out to pay early investors and to Kyle personally, but very little money being used for actual cryptocurrency trading or investment. Michael estimated that of the approximately $12 million that had flowed into Blockchain Ventures over 3 years, only about $2 million had been used for any kind of actual trading, and that trading had lost money rather than generating the returns Kyle was claiming. Michael had also found something more concerning. Several of the cryptocurrency wallets Kyle controlled showed evidence of containing stolen funds. Michael had traced the blockchain transactions backwards and found they originated from known hacking incidents and theft events. Kyle wasn't just running a Ponzi scheme. He was actively stealing cryptocurrency and laundering it through his company's operations. I spent the next several days conducting deeper analysis using techniques that went beyond standard forensic investigation. I'm constrained in what I can describe because some of these techniques remain classified or are covered by non-disclosure agreements from my continued security clearance. But I can say that when you've spent 26 years at the NSA learning how to penetrate hardened networks and extract information from systems that were designed to be secure, you develop capabilities that are extraordinarily powerful. What I found was a comprehensive criminal operation. Kyle had created multiple interconnected schemes. The primary operation was the Ponzi scheme through Blockchain Ventures, which was bringing in money from elderly investors who didn't understand cryptocurrency. But he was also running several other criminal activities using the same infrastructure. He'd created fake cryptocurrency exchanges that looked legitimate, but were actually designed to steal people's login credentials and empty their wallets. He was running phishing operations that sent fake security alerts to cryptocurrency holders, tricking them into revealing their private keys. He was operating several dark web marketplaces that facilitated money laundering and illegal cryptocurrency transactions. The scale of the operation was significant. Kyle had probably stolen or defrauded people of at least $15 million over 3 years. He'd compromised hundreds of cryptocurrency wallets. He'd facilitated money laundering for other criminals. And he'd done it all while maintaining a public persona as a legitimate cryptocurrency entrepreneur and technology innovator. I also discovered Kyle's operational security was terrible despite his claims of being technologically sophisticated. He used the same passwords across multiple systems. He kept detailed records of his criminal activities in supposedly encrypted folders that used weak encryption I could break in hours. He'd had conversations about his schemes on messaging platforms that he thought were secure, but that were actually vulnerable to the kinds of analysis I'd been doing for decades. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a spreadsheet Kyle had created showing his investor accounts and the real status versus what he was reporting to investors. The spreadsheet clearly showed he knew he was running a Ponzi scheme. It showed he was deliberately falsifying returns and fabricating investment activities. It showed he was calculating how long he could keep the scheme going before it collapsed. This wasn't incompetent business management. It was calculated, deliberate fraud. I found email correspondence between Kyle and several associates discussing expanding the operation and targeting more elderly investors specifically because they were easier to deceive about technology. One email from Kyle literally said that people over 60 were perfect marks because they were intimidated by cryptocurrency technology and wouldn't ask difficult questions if you used enough technical jargon. That email alone demonstrated intent to defraud and showed he was deliberately targeting vulnerable victims. I also discovered evidence that Kyle had been cheating on Emily during their marriage. He'd been involved with multiple women, including several he'd met through his business who he'd apparently impressed with his wealth and his claims of being a cryptocurrency genius. Some of these relationships had involved him convincing these women to invest in his company or to help him recruit other investors. Kyle had been running romance scams alongside his investment fraud. 1 week into my investigation, Kyle came to my house again. He said he wanted to give me another chance to invest before he closed the current investment round to new participants. He sat at my kitchen table with his laptop and showed me even more grandiose projections. He said he was about to launch a new cryptocurrency token that would revolutionize decentralized finance. Early investors would see 1,000% returns within a year. But I needed to commit immediately because this opportunity wouldn't last. I asked Kyle specific technical questions about how his token would work, what blockchain it would run on, what the tokenomics were, what problem it was solving. Kyle gave vague answers full of buzzwords, but empty of actual technical content. It was clear he was just making things up, confident that I wouldn't understand enough about the technology to recognize he was lying. Then I asked Kyle about the investors he'd mentioned previously who were seeing such great returns. Could he put me in touch with any of them so I could hear firsthand about their experiences? Kyle said that wouldn't be possible because his clients valued their privacy and he had strict confidentiality agreements. I asked if he could at least provide references or documentation of the returns his investment strategy was actually generating. Kyle said the proprietary nature of his algorithms meant he couldn't share detailed performance data, but I should trust him because he was family and because Emily would have wanted him to help me. I told Kyle I'd done some research on his company and had found some concerning information. I mentioned I'd seen that Blockchain Ventures wasn't properly registered with the SEC. I mentioned that the technical claims on his website didn't make sense to someone who actually understood blockchain technology. I mentioned that the returns he was promising weren't possible through legitimate trading. Kyle's expression shifted from confident to defensive. He said I didn't understand how modern finance worked, that regulations were outdated and didn't apply to cryptocurrency, that his technology was so advanced that it seemed impossible to people who weren't experts. I asked Kyle directly if he was running a Ponzi scheme. His face went red, and he said that was an insulting accusation. He said he was a legitimate businessman who was being attacked by an old man who was jealous of his success and who didn't understand technology. He said if I was going to make accusations like that, our relationship was over. He packed up his laptop and left, slamming the door on his way out. After Kyle left, I sat at my kitchen table thinking about how criminals often reveal themselves through their reactions when confronted. Someone running a legitimate business would have welcomed questions and would have provided documentation to address concerns. Kyle had gotten defensive, angry, and had left without providing any actual evidence his business was legitimate. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. I called James Patterson and told him I was ready to provide the FBI with comprehensive evidence of Kyle's criminal operation. James said they'd been building their own case, but had been missing some key pieces, particularly the technical evidence of how the fraud was being perpetrated and how the money was flowing. I told him I could provide all of that. James said they'd want to move quickly once they had the evidence, because Ponzi schemes eventually collapse, and they wanted to take action before Kyle either fled the country or more investors lost money. I called Sarah Martinez and told her I could provide evidence of unregistered securities offerings, false statements to investors, and securities fraud. Sarah said the SEC was ready to file civil charges and seek an asset freeze as soon as they had sufficient documentation. I told her I'd have a complete evidence package within 48 hours. I called Michael Chun and asked him to prepare a final report on his cryptocurrency forensic analysis, including details of all the stolen funds he'd identified and the blockchain analysis showing how Kyle had laundered stolen cryptocurrency. Michael said his report would clearly demonstrate Kyle had been involved in theft and money laundering in addition to the Ponzi scheme. Over the next 2 days, I compiled everything into a comprehensive intelligence package. I organized it the way I'd learned to do at the NSA, starting with an executive summary for decision-makers who needed the key points quickly, then detailed analysis sections with supporting evidence, then appendices with raw technical data and documentation. The package ran to over 300 pages including exhibits, charts showing money flows, technical analysis of the infrastructure, communications intercepts, and forensic evidence. I included timeline analysis showing when Kyle had set up various components of his operation. I included technical analysis explaining how the Ponzi scheme worked and how Kyle had been stealing cryptocurrency. I included financial analysis showing where investor money had actually gone versus what Kyle claimed. I included communications evidence showing Kyle knew he was committing fraud and was deliberately targeting vulnerable victims. The package also included the evidence Emily had gathered before she died, properly contextualized and explained. My daughter had been trying to expose Kyle's fraud when the accident took her. Now her evidence would be part of building the case that would bring him to justice. I delivered the intelligence package simultaneously to the FBI, the SEC, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Secret Service's Electronic Crimes Task Force. All 4 agencies had jurisdiction over different aspects of Kyle's criminal operation. The FBI would handle the wire fraud and the Ponzi scheme. The SEC would handle the securities violations. The IRS would handle the tax evasion from his unreported income. The Secret Service would handle the cyber crimes and the theft of financial assets through hacking. James Patterson called me the day after receiving the package. He said it was one of the most comprehensive fraud investigation packages he'd seen in 20 years with the Bureau. The evidence was meticulously documented, the technical analysis was sophisticated, and the organization made it easy for prosecutors to understand the case. James said they'd be moving forward immediately with search warrants and would probably have Kyle in custody within a week. Kyle had dismissed me as too old for technology. He'd thought his cryptocurrency expertise and his understanding of blockchain made him superior to some old government IT worker. He'd been so confident in his technological sophistication that he hadn't considered the possibility that someone from my generation might actually understand the technology better than he did. He'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating someone who'd spent 26 years at the NSA. Someone who'd forgotten more about cryptography than Kyle had ever learned. Someone who developed offensive cyber capabilities against nation-state adversaries and could apply those same capabilities to investigating a civilian criminal. Someone who'd spent a career building comprehensive intelligence packages that led to operations against targets who thought they were secure. The investigation was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. The agencies were ready to act. Kyle's operation was about to be dismantled with the same precision the NSA used to dismantle adversary networks. And it had all been done by someone he'd dismissed as too old to understand technology. The FBI executed search warrants on Blockchain Ventures' offices and Kyle's residence at 0600 on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after I'd delivered my intelligence package. Federal agents don't announce their intentions or give targets time to destroy evidence. They move fast. They move early when people are still sleeping, and they move with overwhelming force. 20 agents hit Kyle's home simultaneously with agents hitting the company offices, freezing all computer systems, securing all records, and preventing anyone from destroying evidence. James Patterson called me at 0730 to inform me the operation had been successful. They'd seized Kyle's computers, phones, servers, and financial records. Kyle had been taken into custody without incident. Apparently, he'd been so shocked when FBI agents knocked on his door before sunrise that he hadn't even thought about resisting or destroying evidence. James said Kyle had immediately asked for an attorney and hadn't said anything substantive, but they didn't need his cooperation because the evidence I provided gave them everything they needed. The SEC filed civil charges that same morning seeking an immediate asset freeze and appointment of a receiver to take control of Blockchain Ventures. The SEC's complaint was public record, and it detailed Kyle's Ponzi scheme, his unregistered securities offerings, and his false statements to investors. The complaint specifically mentioned that Kyle had targeted elderly investors who didn't understand cryptocurrency technology, using technical jargon to deceive them into believing his fraudulent investment scheme was legitimate. The criminal complaint filed by the FBI and unsealed that afternoon charged Kyle with wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit computer fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The complaint described his multifaceted criminal operation, the Ponzi scheme through Blockchain Ventures, the theft of cryptocurrency through hacking and phishing, the operation of fraudulent exchanges, and the facilitation of money laundering. The potential prison time if convicted on all counts exceeded 20 years. By that evening, the story was all over the news. Local news covered it as a major fraud case affecting elderly investors in the region. Technology news sites covered it as an example of cryptocurrency fraud. Cybersecurity publications covered the hacking and theft aspects. My name wasn't mentioned in any of the coverage, which was how I'd wanted it. I'd provided evidence to law enforcement and let them take credit for the investigation. Kyle's attorney held a press conference the next day, claiming his client was innocent and was being persecuted by overzealous regulators who didn't understand cryptocurrency technology. The attorney said Blockchain Ventures was a legitimate investment company that had simply faced some business challenges, and that the criminal charges were based on misunderstandings of how decentralized finance worked. The press conference was a disaster. Reporters asked pointed questions about the Ponzi scheme allegations and about evidence that Kyle had stolen cryptocurrency, and the attorney had no good answers. Within 48 hours of the search warrants being executed, over 30 of Kyle's investors had contacted the FBI and the SEC with additional complaints. They'd been reading the news coverage and had realized they'd been defrauded. Some had been trying to withdraw their money for months and had been given excuses about market volatility or technical issues with blockchain transfers. Others had been receiving statements showing growing account balances but had never been able to actually access their funds. The scope of the fraud was becoming clear. Kyle had taken money from over 200 investors totaling approximately $15 million. The court-appointed receiver who took control of Blockchain Ventures discovered that the company had less than $300,000 in actual assets. The rest of the money investors thought they'd invested in cryptocurrency had been spent by Kyle on personal expenses, used to pay returns to early investors in the Ponzi scheme, or had been stolen outright and moved to offshore accounts. The receiver's preliminary report confirmed everything my investigation had found. Blockchain Ventures had been a fraud from its inception. 3 days after Kyle's arrest, I received a visit from 2 federal agents I didn't recognize. They showed credentials identifying them as from the Secret Service's Electronic Crimes Task Force. They asked if they could speak with me about the Blockchain Ventures investigation. I invited them in and made coffee, and we sat in my living room to talk. The lead agent, a woman named Karen Martinez, said they wanted to thank me for the intelligence package I provided. She said the technical analysis of Kyle's cyber crimes had been exceptionally detailed and had given them evidence they wouldn't have been able to develop on their own in the time frame they'd had to work with. She asked about my background that had enabled me to conduct such a sophisticated analysis. I told her about my 26 years at the NSA doing cyber operations and cryptanalysis. Karen said that made sense. The analysis had shown capabilities that went beyond what commercial security firms typically did. She asked if I'd be willing to consult with the Secret Service on other cryptocurrency fraud cases. They were seeing an explosion of crypto scams, and many of them had technical sophistication that challenged their investigators. Someone with my background could be valuable in helping them understand and counter these operations. I agreed to consider consulting work with the Secret Service, though I mentioned I was already doing some work for other agencies and private sector clients. Karen gave me her card and said she'd be in touch. After they left, I sat thinking about how Kyle had dismissed my government IT work as irrelevant to modern technology, and now federal agents were asking me to help them investigate cases because my experience was so valuable. 2 weeks after Kyle's arrest, the grand jury returned indictments adding additional charges based on evidence discovered during the execution of the search warrants. The new charges included additional counts of wire fraud, multiple counts of computer fraud and abuse, and charges related to specific thefts of cryptocurrency from individual victims whose wallets Kyle had compromised. The superseding indictment painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal operation that had stolen from hundreds of victims over several years. Kyle's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutors weren't interested in being generous. The evidence was overwhelming. The victims were sympathetic, and the dollar amounts were substantial. The government was prepared to go to trial and was confident of conviction on most, if not all, counts. Kyle's attorney tried to argue that his client was young and had made mistakes, but wasn't a hardened criminal. The prosecutors pointed out that the evidence showed deliberate, calculated fraud over years, not youthful mistakes. 1 month after the arrest, I was asked to testify before the grand jury about the technical aspects of Kyle's operation. I spent 4 hours walking the grand jury through how the Ponzi scheme had worked, how Kyle had stolen cryptocurrency through hacking and phishing, how he'd laundered the stolen funds, and how the technical evidence proved Kyle had known exactly what he was doing. The grand jurors asked good questions and seemed to understand that this wasn't a case of someone making honest mistakes. It was deliberate criminal activity. After my testimony, the prosecutor told me I'd been an excellent witness and that my ability to explain complex technical concepts in terms non-technical people could understand was valuable. She said if the case went to trial, they'd definitely want me to testify about the technical evidence. I told her I'd be available if needed. 6 weeks after the arrest, the court held a detention hearing to determine if Kyle would remain in custody pending trial or would be released on bail. The government argued Kyle was both a flight risk and a danger to the community. They presented evidence that Kyle had been moving money to offshore accounts in the months before his arrest, suggesting he'd been preparing to flee. They presented evidence he'd been discussing with associates the possibility of leaving the country if regulatory scrutiny became too intense. Kyle's attorney argued his client had ties to the community, had no prior criminal record, and deserved to be released on bail with electronic monitoring. I attended the hearing, sitting in the gallery with several of Kyle's victims who'd come to watch the proceedings. The judge listened to arguments from both sides, reviewed the evidence, and ruled that Kyle would remain in detention. The judge said the sophistication of the fraud, the number of victims, the substantial dollar amounts, and the evidence of potential flight planning all supported continued detention. Kyle looked shocked when the judge announced the ruling. He'd apparently expected to be released and hadn't prepared himself for the possibility of staying in jail until trial. As marshals led him out of the courtroom, he looked back at the gallery and his eyes met mine for a moment. I saw recognition and something else, perhaps the beginning of understanding that he'd catastrophically underestimated someone he'd dismissed as too old to matter. 3 months after the arrest, Kyle's legal situation had deteriorated further. Federal investigators had discovered additional crimes while examining the evidence seized from his computers. They'd found that Kyle had been involved in identity theft operations, had been selling stolen personal information on dark web marketplaces, and had been facilitating other criminals' money laundering through his infrastructure. New charges were added. The potential prison time grew to over 30 years if convicted on all counts. Kyle's attorney came back to prosecutors with a serious plea offer. Kyle would plead guilty to multiple felony counts, cooperate fully with investigations of other criminals he'd facilitated, and accept a recommended sentence of 12 to 15 years in federal prison. In exchange, the government would drop some of the charges and would recommend the sentences run concurrently rather than consecutively. The prosecutors agreed to consider the offer. I received a call from the lead prosecutor asking for my opinion about the plea deal. She said my victim impact statement would carry significant weight, and she wanted to know how I felt about Kyle potentially receiving 12 to 15 years rather than going to trial and risking 30 years. I told her that what mattered most to me was that Kyle's victims were compensated as much as possible and that other potential victims were protected by Kyle being imprisoned. If the plea deal accomplished those goals and saved the victims from the trauma of a lengthy trial, I supported it. 4 months after his arrest, Kyle pleaded guilty in federal court to 15 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, computer fraud and abuse, and aggravated identity theft. He stood before the judge and admitted that he'd run a Ponzi scheme through blockchain ventures, that he'd stolen cryptocurrency from hundreds of victims, that he'd deliberately targeted elderly investors because he thought they'd be easy to deceive, and that he'd known his actions were criminal but had done them anyway for personal profit. The plea hearing was cathartic for many of Kyle's victims who attended. They heard him finally admit what he'd done. They heard the judge tell him his conduct was reprehensible and had caused devastating harm to vulnerable people who trusted him. They heard the prosecutor describe the investigation and the evidence, including mention of the technical analysis that had exposed the full scope of Kyle's criminal operation, though I wasn't mentioned by name. After the plea hearing, several of Kyle's victims approached me in the courthouse hallway. They'd figured out from news coverage and from talking to investigators that I'd been the one who'd exposed Kyle's operation and had provided the evidence that led to his arrest. They thanked me for doing what law enforcement hadn't been able to do quickly enough. One elderly woman in her 70s told me she'd lost $200,000, her entire retirement savings, to Kyle's scheme, and she'd thought she'd never see any kind of justice. Seeing Kyle plead guilty and face prison time meant everything to her, even if she never recovered her money. I told them I'd done what anyone with my skills and knowledge should have done when they discovered criminal activity. I told them I was sorry they'd been victimized, and I hoped the criminal proceedings and the civil recovery efforts would provide some measure of justice and compensation. Several of them said they felt stupid for having been deceived by Kyle's technical jargon and his confidence, but I told them they shouldn't feel stupid. Kyle was a practiced con artist who deliberately used complex technology terminology to confuse and intimidate people, and that wasn't their fault. 6 months after Kyle's arrest, the sentencing hearing was held. The prosecutor recommended 14 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Kyle's attorney asked for the minimum possible sentence, arguing his client had accepted responsibility by pleading guilty and had cooperated with investigations of other criminals. The judge heard from multiple victims who described the financial and emotional devastation Kyle's crimes had caused. I didn't give a victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing. This wasn't about me personally. It was about the people Kyle had stolen from and the broader harm he'd caused. But I did submit a written statement that was part of the pre-sentencing report. I described discovering Kyle's criminal operation, the investigation I'd conducted, and my professional opinion that Kyle's crimes showed sophistication and planning that reflected someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had deliberately targeted vulnerable victims. The judge sentenced Kyle to 15 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and ordered him to pay $14.7 million in restitution. The judge said Kyle's crimes were serious, had harmed many vulnerable victims, and had been committed with sophistication and planning over several years. The judge said the sentence needed to reflect the seriousness of the crimes, to punish Kyle appropriately, and to deter others who might think cryptocurrency fraud was a low-risk, high-reward criminal activity. Kyle stood there as the judge pronounced sentence, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. He'd gone from being a successful cryptocurrency CEO who thought he was smarter than everyone else to being a convicted felon facing 15 years in prison. The transformation had taken 6 months from arrest to sentencing. As marshals led Kyle out of the courtroom to begin his prison sentence, I thought about our conversation in my kitchen when he dismissed me as too old for technology. I thought about how he'd been so confident in his cryptocurrency knowledge and his blockchain expertise that he'd never considered someone from my generation might actually understand the technology better than he did. I thought about how his underestimation of an old NSA officer had been the beginning of his downfall. Kyle had learned what many criminals learn too late, that expertise doesn't expire, that underestimating opponents is fatal, and that someone who spent 26 years developing offensive cyber capabilities for the NSA is capable of investigating and exposing criminal operations with devastating thoroughness. The old man he'd dismissed as too old for technology had systematically dismantled his entire criminal empire. The year following Kyle's sentencing brought a systematic effort to recover funds for his victims and to rebuild lives that had been devastated by his fraud. The court-appointed receiver who'd taken control of Blockchain Ventures' assets worked tirelessly to trace where investor money had gone and to recover whatever could be salvaged from the wreckage of Kyle's criminal operation. It was painstaking work requiring forensic accounting, international cooperation to access offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency tracing across multiple blockchains. Michael Chun, the cryptocurrency forensic analyst I'd worked with during the investigation, became the receiver's primary technical expert. His ability to trace cryptocurrency transactions across complex blockchain networks was crucial to recovering stolen funds. Over the course of 12 months, Michael identified approximately $4.2 million in cryptocurrency and cash that could be recovered and distributed to victims. It was far less than the $14.7 million Kyle had stolen, but it was something. And for some victims, it meant the difference between complete destitution and having some foundation to rebuild their lives. The elderly woman who'd lost her entire $200,000 retirement savings received approximately $56,000 from the receiver's distribution. It wasn't enough to restore what she'd lost, but it helped. She told me later that what mattered more than the money was seeing Kyle held accountable and knowing that someone had cared enough to expose his crimes and bring him to justice. She'd felt invisible and stupid after being defrauded, but the investigation and prosecution had validated that she'd been the victim of a sophisticated criminal, not a foolish person making bad decisions. I used some of Emily's life insurance money that Kyle had probably been planning to access before his arrest, to establish a foundation providing support for elderly victims of financial fraud. The foundation offered free financial counseling, help navigating victim compensation programs, and small emergency grants to victims facing immediate financial crisis. It also funded educational programs teaching seniors about common fraud schemes and how to protect themselves, with particular focus on cryptocurrency scams that use technical jargon to confuse and intimidate people. The Foundation's first educational seminar was held at a local senior center, and over 100 people attended. I gave a presentation explaining cryptocurrency technology in plain language, describing how legitimate cryptocurrency worked and how criminals perverted that technology for fraud. I explained warning signs of crypto scams, promises of guaranteed high returns, pressure to invest quickly, complex technical explanations that didn't really explain anything, and targeting of people who admitted they didn't understand the technology. After the presentation, dozens of people came up to tell me they'd been approached by people pitching cryptocurrency investments and had been uncertain whether they were legitimate. Several said they'd been feeling pressure from family members or friends to invest in crypto and had been worried they were missing out on opportunities. I told them that legitimate investment opportunities don't require immediate decisions, don't promise guaranteed returns, and don't make investors feel stupid for asking questions. The relief on their faces when they realized they'd been right to be skeptical was palpable. The Foundation's work attracted attention from law enforcement and regulatory agencies. I was invited to speak at FBI training sessions about cryptocurrency fraud and how to investigate it. I gave presentations at SEC conferences about identifying Ponzi schemes disguised with blockchain technology. I consulted with the Secret Service on multiple cases involving cryptocurrency theft and fraud. My age, the thing Kyle had used to dismiss my relevance, actually became an asset because I could relate to elderly victims and could explain technical concepts in ways that non-technical investigators and prosecutors could understand. 6 months after Kyle's sentencing, I received a call from James Patterson at the FBI. He said they'd arrested 3 of Kyle's associates who'd been involved in his criminal operation. The evidence I provided had included communications between Kyle and these associates discussing money laundering and the operation of fraudulent cryptocurrency exchanges. Kyle's cooperation as part of his plea deal had provided additional evidence. James said these prosecutions wouldn't have been possible without the comprehensive intelligence package I'd built, and the Bureau was grateful for my work. I also received a call from the Secret Service offering me a formal consulting contract to help investigate cryptocurrency fraud cases. They'd been impressed with my work on the Blockchain Ventures case and wanted to retain me to analyze other complex crypto crimes. I accepted the contract, which gave me legal authority and proper compensation to do work I'd been doing anyway. Over the next year, I consulted on 15 different cases involving cryptocurrency fraud, theft, and money laundering, helping federal agents understand the technical aspects and trace the flow of stolen funds. The consulting work was intellectually satisfying and felt like a continuation of my NSA career. I was using the same analytical skills and technical capabilities I developed over 26 years, just applied to civilian criminal investigations rather than foreign intelligence operations. The work proved conclusively that expertise in cryptography, computer security, and digital forensics doesn't expire with age. If anything, decades of experience made me more effective because I'd seen so many variations of attacks and schemes that I could quickly identify patterns that less experienced analysts missed. 1 year after Kyle's sentencing, I was invited to testify before a Senate committee examining cryptocurrency fraud and the need for stronger regulation. I sat at the witness table in a hearing room on Capitol Hill and explained to senators how criminals were exploiting cryptocurrency technology and how vulnerable populations, particularly elderly investors, were being targeted. I described Kyle's case as an example of how sophisticated criminals could use technical jargon to deceive people and how important it was to have law enforcement with technical expertise to investigate these crimes. Several senators asked me about my background and how I developed the skills to investigate Kyle's operation. I explained my 26 years at the NSA and my continued work in cybersecurity. One senator asked directly whether my age, I was now 65, had been a disadvantage in investigating crimes involving cutting-edge technology. I told him age had been an advantage, not a disadvantage. Kyle had underestimated me because of my age, which had made him careless. My decades of experience had given me perspective that younger analysts wouldn't have. And my deep understanding of cryptographic principles and computer systems, knowledge that doesn't change just because new applications are developed, had been crucial to unraveling Kyle's technical deceptions. The senator's follow-up question was whether government agencies were making good use of experienced professionals in investigating cybercrimes, or whether age discrimination was preventing agencies from accessing valuable expertise. I told him honestly that the NSA had been excellent about retaining and utilizing experienced personnel, but some other agencies had age-related challenges. Many of the best technical investigators in federal law enforcement were people my age or older who'd spent decades developing expertise, yet they often faced assumptions from younger colleagues that they couldn't understand modern technology. I suggested the government needed to do better at recognizing that experience was an asset in technical fields, not a liability. My testimony was covered in several technology and cybersecurity publications. Multiple journalists wrote articles about the blockchain ventures case and my role in exposing it, focusing on the angle of an older cybersecurity expert taking down a young crypto scammer who'd dismissed him as too old for technology. The articles resonated with many readers who'd experienced age discrimination in technical fields. I received hundreds of emails from people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who worked in technology and had been made to feel obsolete by younger colleagues who didn't understand that foundational knowledge and experience were more valuable than familiarity with the latest buzzwords. 18 months after Kyle's sentencing, I was invited to give a keynote address at a major cybersecurity conference. The topic was Experience Matters: Why Age is an Asset in Cybersecurity. I talked about how the fundamental principles of computer security haven't changed: defense in depth, understanding attacker capabilities, thinking systematically about vulnerabilities, building comprehensive threat models. New technologies and new attack vectors emerge constantly, but understanding the underlying principles allows experienced professionals to quickly understand and counter new threats. I described the blockchain ventures case as an example. Kyle had thought cryptocurrency and blockchain were such new technologies that someone from my generation couldn't possibly understand them. But blockchain was just a specific application of cryptographic principles I'd been working with for decades. Cryptocurrency theft was just a new variation of financial fraud I'd seen in many forms. Kyle's technical jargon had seemed sophisticated to people who didn't understand the technology, but to someone with deep technical expertise, it had been obvious nonsense. Experience had allowed me to see through the deception quickly. The keynote was well received and led to multiple speaking invitations at other conferences. I became a somewhat unlikely advocate for recognizing the value of experienced professionals in technical fields. Articles were written about how I represented a growing demographic of older cybersecurity professionals who were proving that expertise doesn't have an expiration date. I received job offers from multiple companies wanting to hire experienced security consultants, far more offers than I could possibly accept. 2 years after Kyle's sentencing, I visited him in federal prison. It wasn't something I'd planned to do, but his attorney had contacted me saying Kyle had asked if I'd be willing to meet with him. Kyle wanted to apologize in person and wanted to understand how I'd uncovered his operation so thoroughly. I was skeptical about his motivations, but I agreed to the meeting out of curiosity about what he might say. The prison visiting room was the standard setup, tables bolted to the floor, guards watching, everything designed to prevent contraband exchange or violence. Kyle was brought in wearing prison khakis, looking older than his 34 years. Prison had not been kind to him. He sat down across from me, and we looked at each other for a long moment before either of us spoke. Kyle started by apologizing. He said he'd been arrogant and greedy and had hurt people who trusted him. He said he'd been especially wrong about me. He dismissed me as a confused old man when I'd actually been far more capable than he'd ever been. He said he'd spent a lot of time in prison thinking about how his assumptions had destroyed his life. I listened without interrupting, trying to assess whether this was genuine remorse or manipulation. Then Kyle asked the question he'd really wanted to ask. He wanted to know how I'd done it, how I'd uncovered everything so completely, how I'd traced his cryptocurrency transactions, how I'd accessed information he'd thought was secure. He said he'd considered himself sophisticated about cybersecurity, yet I'd apparently penetrated his operations with ease. How had someone from my generation, someone who'd worked with computers when they were primitive by modern standards, been able to completely outmatch him technically? I thought about how to answer that question. Then I told Kyle the truth. I explained that the NSA doesn't hire people to do basic computer work. They recruit from the top mathematics and computer science programs in the country. They provide training in cryptanalysis, computer security, and offensive cyber operations that goes far beyond anything available in the civilian world. They give you access to tools and techniques that most people don't know exist. And they put you through 26 years of progressively more challenging work that teaches you how to think about security systematically and comprehensively. I told Kyle that what he'd thought was sophisticated, his blockchain technology, his cryptocurrency schemes, his digital operations, was actually relatively simple from the perspective of someone who'd spent decades developing capabilities against nation-state adversaries with unlimited resources. His security had been adequate against law enforcement without specialized cyber capabilities, but it had been completely inadequate against someone with NSA-level expertise. His mistake hadn't been running a criminal operation. His mistake had been dismissing someone based on age without understanding what that person was actually capable of. Kyle sat there processing this information. Then he asked if I thought he could have succeeded if he'd run a legitimate cryptocurrency business instead of a fraud scheme. I told him honestly that I didn't know. What I did know was that his character flaws, his arrogance, his willingness to steal from vulnerable people, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else, would have caused problems in any business. The cryptocurrency fraud had just been how those character flaws manifested. Kyle said he had 13 more years left on his sentence, and he'd been thinking about what he'd do afterward. He asked if someone with his background could ever work in technology legitimately again, or if he'd destroyed that possibility completely. I told him the felony convictions would make many opportunities impossible, but that he could potentially rebuild if he was willing to work hard, start at the bottom, and prove himself trustworthy over many years. It wouldn't be easy, and he'd never reach the heights he'd claimed before, but redemption was possible if he genuinely committed to it. The visit ended shortly after that. Guards led Kyle back to his cell block, and I walked out of the prison into the bright afternoon sunlight. I'd gone to the meeting curious about what Kyle might say, and I'd left with a complex mixture of feelings. He'd caused tremendous harm and deserved his punishment. But he was also a cautionary example of how intelligence without wisdom, technical knowledge without ethics, and confidence without humility could lead to catastrophic life outcomes. I'm Daniel Reed, 66 years old now. I'm a retired NSA cyber operations officer who spent 26 years developing some of the most sophisticated offensive cyber capabilities in the world and learning that technology expertise is built on foundational principles that don't change even as applications evolve. I'm a father who lost his daughter but who honored her memory by exposing the criminal who deceived her and by helping protect other potential victims from the same fate. Kyle Bradford called me too old for technology and dismissed my government IT work as irrelevant to his sophisticated cryptocurrency business. He thought his youth and his blockchain knowledge made him superior to some old man who'd worked with computers decades ago. He built a criminal empire on fraud and theft, targeting vulnerable people and using technical jargon to confuse and intimidate victims who didn't understand the technology. He learned that NSA cyber operations officers don't become obsolete just because they age. That 26 years of cryptanalysis and offensive cyber capabilities creates expertise that makes civilian cybersecurity look elementary by comparison. That underestimating someone based on age, when that someone has forgotten more about computer security than you'll ever learn, is a mistake that has consequences measured in federal prison time. To anyone facing age discrimination in technical fields, remember this: fundamental knowledge doesn't expire. Understanding cryptographic principles, security architectures, threat modeling, and systematic analysis is more valuable than knowing the latest technology buzzwords. Experience teaches you to recognize patterns, to see through deceptions, to think comprehensively about problems. Don't let anyone make you believe that age makes you obsolete in technology. Often it's exactly the opposite. Kyle's criminal operation fell because he thought technology was about knowing current tools and trends. He didn't understand that deep technical expertise is about understanding principles, about systematic thinking, about comprehensive analysis. Those capabilities only improve with experience. Stand your ground when people dismiss your expertise based on age. Use your knowledge and your experience. Build comprehensive cases when you identify problems. Execute with precision. And prove that decades of experience in technical fields make you more capable, not less. This is Daniel Reed, retired NSA Cyber Operations Officer, signing off. To my fellow experienced technology professionals, your expertise matters more than young technologists might understand. Don't let anyone tell you that age makes you obsolete. The fundamentals you've mastered over decades are more valuable than surface knowledge of current trends. Keep learning, keep contributing, and prove that experience is an asset. The old NSA officer proved that age and experience beat youth and arrogance every single time when it comes to real technical expertise.